The mere possession of a vision is not the same as living it, nor can we encourage others with it if we do not ourselves understand and follow its truths. The path of the Great Spirit is over all of us, but if we follow our own spirits from within, our pattern becomes clearer. For centuries others have sought their visions. They prepare themselves so that if the Creator desires them to know their life's purpose, then a vision would be revealed. But to be blessed with visions is not enough. We must live them. And that was said by High Eagle. Welcome to Surviving the Matrix, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Maxwell Egan. It's a pleasure to be with you again, and I will be your host for the next hour. Well, very interesting times in the world today, indeed, folks. Very interesting times indeed. We still haven't heard much of any substance on the missile launch 50 miles off the coast of LA. Information on that has been kind of noticeable by its absence, if anything. But then that's pretty well what we expect from these people, isn't it, folks? They don't really give us much information on anything that we would actually like to know about. And actually, now I think about it, the media seems to be getting better at it, folks. They seem to be getting better and better at telling the public more and more about less and less, if that made any sense to you at all. But by whatever the method, the powers that be certainly do like keeping information to themselves. And they certainly don't like the public to know what they're up to. And bearing that in mind, when one looks at what's happening around the world, strange patterns begin to emerge. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I had Rob Crombie on the show, and he was talking about his discovery of mortgages that appear to have been on-sold to the state of New York. And this has been done by the Commonwealth Bank here in Australia. It appears that it's also been done by the Macquarie Bank. And these mortgages have effectively been on-sold to America, somewhere in America anyway. It's not really important where, just the fact that they've been on-sold to America is the significant part. What we also find is that in 2001, the state of Queensland in Australia effectively broke away from the rest of the country. And this was done by the Queensland Parliament when they enacted an old constitution. They rewrote and enacted the old constitution that was drafted in the late 1800s and brought it back in over the top of the Australian constitution. This is an act that I would call treason, to be quite honest. I mean, I'd say that every politician that was involved in government at that time of the passing of that constitution should be tried for treason, really, because that's what they've done. And we find that through all of that, Queensland, Australia, has been virtually taken over by a corporation known as the Brigalow Corporation. And this, of course, brings the question to mind, who owns the Brigalow Corporation? And whether that is also owned by American interests. And to be honest, folks, I think it would be a good idea if people started searching through the stocks and indexes exchanges and started finding out which companies are holding their mortgages and if these companies are American companies. Because it would seem that a lot of the bailout money that was given to American financial institutions was used to snap up real estate and building societies and banking institutions and possibly even mortgage bonds all around the world, effectively transferring the ownership of these things into the hands of American companies and American banking interests. And this is significant for a number of reasons. And we also find it through the implementation of such corporations as the Brigalow Corporation and putting them in control of a state, such has been done here in Queensland, Australia, and may well be extrapolating out to the rest of the country soon. They've effectively removed all ownership rights from the people of Queensland. And as I said, this will soon go out across the rest of the country, and it will soon happen overseas as well, if it hasn't already happened, unbeknownst to the people. And what I'm trying to say here is that a lot of these financial trails, if you follow the money, it all seems to lead back to America. And it seems that these have all been bought up by American companies. And one might ask, what would be the point of this? Well, It's very interesting that often among the elite, people such as Henry Kissinger and many others have often praised the Chinese system. How effective and how efficient it is. How easy it is to control the people. How everything is run in such a robot-like fashion. And many of the elite have often expressed a desire to see the Chinese system implemented around the globe. But how could such a thing be done? Well, if all of these mortgages and all of these financial institutions and all of this money can ultimately be traced back to America, then it should also be taken clearly into account that 80% of world debt is owed by America, and most of it is owed to China. So what happens if the American economy crashes and China forecloses on its loans? Then what happens to all of the assets that are owned by these American companies, such as the $3 billion of Australian mortgages that have been on-sold to the state of New York by just one bank that we know of? What happens to all of these assets? What happens to places like Queensland if it is to be found that the Brigalow Corporation does indeed have ties to American financial institutions? When all of these assets transfer to the ownership of China, what happens to all of these assets? And this could well be a way of implementing the Chinese system throughout the world without a shot ever being fired. I mean, as strange as this may all sound to people, upon close examination it would seem that all of the little individual parts of the mechanism that would be required to make such a thing happen are being put in place while nobody's looking. Well, nobody is being told about it anyway. It is, of course, very hard to look when you're not being told where to look, or being told that a particular piece of legislation is being enacted. And let's face it, folks, people don't usually worry about their mortgage bonds. Mortgage bonds are usually something that's pretty secure, and we just kind of go and take out the mortgage loan at the bank, and then we forget about what happens to the mortgage bond, what happens to the piece of paper with our wet ink signature on it. Because it would appear that what happens to it, folks, is that it gets on-sold to companies around the world. And by doing this type of stuff, and by implementing organisations such as the Brigalow Corporation, which, as I said, transfers the ownership of the entire state into the hands of the corporation, including all of the people within the state, and using this type of method, which is completely unconstitutional and downright illegal, but of course you can't tell the government that anything they do is illegal, because the government can't do anything illegal because they make laws. Well, what they do is they create laws that are invalid, so you have to choose your wording carefully and not claim they've done something illegal, but claim that the legislation they are using is invalid. Then it becomes clear to see how easy it is to take over the world on paper. I mean, it's always just on paper, folks. That's the thing, is that, as I've tried to point out to people, the system that we live under only actually exists on paper. I mean, even I speak out about the Constitution. I speak out about the need to protect the Constitution and stand up for the rights that are given to us within the Constitution. But folks, even that is fictional. The whole thing is fictional. It only exists on paper. I mean, the only real law that exists in the world is natural law, and that's it. All of the rest of it is simply legal fiction. I mean, I speak out about the need to protect the Constitution and stand up for your constitutional rights all the time, because the Constitution is the best thing we have if we are going to continue to work within the realms of commercial law, which is essentially legal fiction. But at the moment, the Constitution is the best thing we have to go by. But at least if we stand up for our rights under the Constitution, and once we've re-established these rights, well, perhaps we could even disentangle ourselves from constitutional law as well. Just completely disentangle ourselves from anything that is fictional and go back to natural law. That would be the best thing to do. But of course there is somewhat of a process in doing so. That is, of course, unless the entire population was to simply wake up all at once and stand up and say, hey guys, we're not going to do this anymore. I mean, that would ultimately be the best thing to do, but unfortunately the chances of that happening at this particular time in history are reasonably small. Though more and more people are waking up to the truths of our world all the time, it's actually good to see things like the Brigalow Corporation being exposed to the public, because this is something that affects everybody. and should hopefully cause a little bit of indignation in people, and we will see more and more people standing up. I mean, also things like Bill S-510, which is being enacted in America, which is going to effectively destroy people's rights to grow a garden in their yard. These sorts of things also should cause a wave of indignation across the country. And I believe they are voting on Bill S-510 very soon if they haven't done so already. And should this bill be passed, folks, then every single person in America who is able to grow a garden needs to immediately put a garden in flagrant violation against this bill. You all need to stand up in protest of this bill. You've got to understand that as a law, telling you that you can't grow food, as a law, it does not exist. It does not matter what legislation is enacted by whichever criminal scumbag happens to sit in the White House. The law itself does not exist. It is simply a bunch of lines on a piece of paper. It doesn't mean anything, folks. And you need to go out of your way to disobey this corrupt legislation, and you need to support everybody you see who is growing gardens. If you see someone being arrested for growing a garden, you need to go to their aid. You need to stand up and all go there and tell the police that you are not going to allow them to arrest someone for growing food, and you would like the police to actually do their job and protect the citizens and go and arrest the corrupt corporate scumbag who enacted the legislation. That's what needs to happen. People have got to stand up and start defending themselves against this type of terrorist activity. Recently in Canada, someone actually posted on my Facebook page a video of a whole bunch of terrorist police officers in Canada arresting an 81-year-old man. They were kneeling on his back. They had his face pushed into the dirt because he apparently ran a red light, which witnesses say he didn't run. But there's like 2 or 3 police cars full of terrorist thugs in black uniforms, all terrorizing these people. And the real problem about it was that there were citizens standing by watching. All of the citizens should have gone to the aid of these people and prevented this type of thuggery from being carried out against the citizens by the terrorist police officers who were carrying it out. Because they are terrorists, folks. I've said before, the Oxford Dictionary definition of terrorism is violence or the threat of violence carried out against civilians as a means of coercion, often for political reasons. This is exactly the activity that we are now seeing from our police officers. And this is terrorism. There is absolutely no debate whether this is terrorism, because it is. And so the citizens need to stand up and address this type of activity. You see, the only way we're going to combat any of this is with unity, folks. I mean, you can't stand idly by and watch your neighbours being brutalised by terrorists simply because some squiggly lines on a piece of paper somewhere apparently gives them the power to do so. Because this is not protecting the citizenry. Protecting the citizenry is going and arresting the criminal scumbags who enact corrupt legislation such as Bill S-510, which is going to prevent people from growing healthy food. That is protecting the population. Law enforcement and blind obedience to whichever legislation is handed to you is not protecting the population. It's not doing the right thing. It's not thinking with your brain. It's not even being a human being. And it's about time people woke up to this and started taking matters in hand peacefully. And if you get in trouble and they try to say that you were interfering with a police officer in the performance of his duty, stand up and say, no, I was not interfering with a police officer in the performance of his duty. I was actually intervening in the actions of a terrorist thug who was brutalizing a member of the public. And the most disturbing part about it of all was the fact that this terrorist thug happened to be wearing a police uniform. And if terrorizing and brutalizing members of the public is what is described as a police officer in the performance of his duty, then we need to have some serious investigation into our police forces. That's what I would be saying to them anyway. Remember, these are actually peace officers, folks, and I do not see how terrorizing a member of the public is preserving the peace in any way, shape or form. Any judge that upholds the actions of these terrorist police officers is, of course, also completely corrupt, and the case should then be appealed to a higher court, and charges should also be laid against the judge. I mean, let's get real about it.